Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever grappled with ideas that feel, incredibly profound, but they're just famously difficult to get your head around? Today, we're diving deep into the world of G.W.F. Hegel. Now, he's a philosopher whose name often brings up images of, well, dense, really abstract texts, but don't let that reputation put you off. We're going to approach his work through a really powerful and I think quite accessible lens,
Yeah.
motion theory. And looking at it this way, Hegel's complex ideas about reality, about change, and especially contradiction, they start to become surprisingly clear and honestly incredibly relevant. Yeah, so motion theory, at its heart, it basically says that everything we experience, from the tiniest particle right up to whole societies, is fundamentally structured motion. And Hegel, seen this way, he basically gives us a kind of owner's manual for the logic of that motion. He's trying to explain how transformation, how development, and crucially, how contradictions are the real engines driving reality itself.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here, when you view Hegel through this motion theory framework, is you see someone who, like centuries ago, was actually laying the groundwork for modern systems thinking. He wasn't seeing reality as static, fixed things. He saw it as this fundamentally dynamic, constantly evolving process. So our mission in this deep dive is really to pull out those key insights, those sort of nuggets from his dense work, and show how they really resonate with, well, contemporary scientific understanding, especially using the language of motion theory.
Right. And for this journey, our main guide is G.W.F. Hegel, 1770–1831, Becoming, Negation, and the Motion of Thought. It's a fantastic source, really, because it integrates Hegel's ideas directly with motion theory. It does a great job bridging that gap.
Before we jump all the way in, maybe it's useful to quickly touch on some shared vocabulary for motion theory, just so we're all on the same page.
Good idea. Makes sense.
Okay, so when we talk about space, think of it as unresolved background change, sort of the potential for motion. Time, or rather time, the measurement, is basically comparing update rates across different loops of motion. How fast one pattern changes relative to another.
Okay.
Energy is essentially tension within that motion.
Hmm.
Mass is resistance to changes in motion. Gravity we see as this convergence toward higher synchronization density patterns pulling together into tighter coherence.
Hmm.
And fields are basically gradients in motion, like slopes or contours in the motion landscape. And the key thing to remember is that structures, things that seem stable, persist when their synchronization density, we call it S, stays high, and their leak or drag R stays low. They hold together.
Got it. High S, low R. That's the stability recipe.
Okay, so with that motion theory toolkit in mind, let's dive into Hegel's big vision. He had this really radical idea that reality isn't about fixed things, but about becoming. What exactly did he mean by that? Reality is process. Right, so Hegel's whole massive project, if you look across his major works like the Phenomenology of Spirit or the Science of Logic, it really boils down to maybe four core claims. The first one, as you said, is that reality is process. It is becoming. He argued that concepts we usually see as static opposites, like, say, being and nothing, they aren't really separate. They constantly pass over into each other. The real truth of either one is actually their motion, their dynamic interplay.
Yeah.
Now, from a motion theory perspective, this makes perfect sense. Measurable reality isn't in isolated snapshots, but in the changes, the updates, the synchronizations among patterns. When we talk about S synchronization density, we're describing how tightly woven those motion patterns are. You can't really grasp what something is without seeing its dynamic process of becoming.
That really shifts the focus, doesn't it? It's not the noun, it's the verb. Okay, what's the second big claim?
The second one is, I think, incredibly powerful. Contradiction, or what he called negativity, is productive. I mean, most of us think of tension, conflict, contradiction as purely bad, right? Destructive. But for Hegel, the tensions inside a form, they don't just break it apart. They actually propel it into a richer, more complex, more developed form. The world moves, he thought, precisely because its parts never perfectly fit together. That inherent misfit, that internal tension, well, that's the engine of change, not some kind of flaw to be eliminated.
Wow, okay. That's a huge reframe, seeing tension not just as struggle, but as the fuel for evolution. So how does this development actually unfold? Is it just random?
No, not at all. That leads to his third claim. Development is imminent and structured. It's not chaotic. There's an underlying logic, he argued. There are stages he famously talks about: being, then essence, then concept. And these logical stages, this pattern of development, it tends to recur. You see it in nature. You see it in how the mind develops. You see it in history. There's a kind of deep underlying grammar to how things evolve and transform.
A universal grammar for change.
Right.
Interesting. And that brings us to the fourth claim, the really famous one, maybe infamous, the absolute. What was that about for him?
Right, the absolute. This isn't some static God figure or ultimate substance sitting outside everything. For Hegel, the absolute is the whole process coming to know itself. It's self-relating motion. Think of it
Yeah.
like the entire dynamic loop of reality, looking back at itself, understanding its own ongoing, evolving nature. So yeah, those four claims really form the foundation of his whole incredibly ambitious philosophical system.
Okay, so reality is this constant becoming driven forward by these internal contradictions unfolding in structured stages. How did Hegel actually see this motion being built up in advance? This is where we have to get into his most famous and maybe, like you said, most misunderstood idea, the dialectic.
Absolutely right. The dialectic gets massively oversimplified. People often trot out that simple thesis, antithesis, synthesis triangle,
Hmm.
but Hegel's idea was much more sophisticated, much more powerful. He talked about determinate negation. Now, negation here isn't just wiping something out. It describes how a form or a system runs into its own internal limit, its own inherent contradiction or inadequacy. And the crucial move, the step beyond this limit, the negation, it doesn't just destroy the old form. It manages to, quote, preserve what worked while canceling what failed.
Oh.
This really complex idea is captured perfectly in that famous German term, Aufhebung.
Aufhebung, yeah, that's the one. It's notoriously tricky because it means like to cancel, but also to preserve and to lift up all at the same time. For me, a really good analogy, something that helps me remember it, is thinking about software development. It's like a refactor and upgrade. You find a bug that's the limit, the negation, you cancel the bug, you keep the code that actually works, and then you ship version 2.0. It's a leap forward, but it carries the useful bits of the past with it, just improved.
That's a fantastic analogy, actually. It captures that preserve and transcend aspect really well. And if we translate this determinate negation into motion theory terms, it becomes, I think, even clearer. Imagine a system, like a loop of synchronized motion. It hits a phase error, right? A glitch, a perturbation. That's the negation, a moment of desynchronization. So what happens next? It has to rephase, find a new stability, but it often does so by shifting into a higher coherence loop. That's the synthesis bit, achieving a state of higher synchronization density, higher S. And crucially, as your analogy points out, it typically retains its stable subroutines, the parts of the motion that were already working efficiently. It's not a reset. It's an intelligent adaptive evolution.
Okay, that connects back to contradiction then.
Yeah.
How did Hegel see contradiction as inner difference? It sounds like he thought any seemingly simple, rigid identity, let's say A, isn't really that simple. It implicitly contains a not A. It depends on what it excludes or pushes against.
Precisely. For Hegel, contradiction wasn't some mistake in logic we need to fix. It's actually the truth about things that seem fixed and stable. Any apparently solid pattern or concept, your A, inherently relies on its opposite. It's not A for its very definition. Its identity is shaped by what it isn't or what it depends on. In motion theory terms, we might say any pattern has inherent leak channels, pathways for potential desynchronization or dependencies on its environment. So true stability, interestingly, often isn't about stamping out all difference. It might actually need these counter modes, these apparent opposites, to maintain its balance. A system trying to be perfectly pure and suppress all internal difference could actually become brittle, less stable.
That's really counterintuitive, but makes sense. Okay, and then there's the concept, or Begriff in German. How is that a self-moving form? What does that mean?
Right, the big riff. For Hegel, this isn't just an idea floating in your head. It's a structure, a dynamic form that actually generates its own rules, its own constraints. It's self-legislating in a way. Think of it like a complex system that sets its own operating principles and then continually modifies those principles based on its own internal performance and feedback. In motion theory, we can model this pretty directly. It's like an autonomous controller whose internal error signals those very negations or contradictions we've been talking about are precisely what drive its adaptive resynchronization. It becomes a self-regulating controller that doesn't just follow a fixed policy, but actively writes and revises its own policy as it interacts with the world, learning from its mistakes or mismatches.
And he took this logic right into the social world too, didn't he? With the famous master bondsman dialectic, looking at how recognition shapes who we are.
Yes, absolutely. That's a classic part of the phenomenology. Hegel argued that our sense of self, our identity, doesn't just pop out of nowhere in isolation. It actually crystallizes through mutual recognition. How others see us, how they acknowledge us or don't, and how we in turn recognize them, this dynamic exchange is what forges our self-consciousness. In motion theory terms, you could translate this as identity being like a synchronization contract between agents. Social loops, like relationships or communities, gain stability through this reciprocal prediction and adjustment. When you recognize someone, you're essentially trying to synchronize your internal model of them with their own self-model and actions, creating a more coherent, predictable, and a stable social pattern.
Okay, so this is all incredibly rich, maybe still a bit abstract. But it really feels like he was onto something fundamental that resonates today. Let's explore what aged well in Hegel's philosophy. Where do we see the strongest overlap with motion theory and modern science?
Oh, profoundly so. I think a huge takeaway that's just become more and more relevant is his emphasis on process over substance. You see this convergence across so many scientific fields now. Physics, for example, shifted from thinking about fundamental things to focusing on fields, interactions, and symmetries, which are all about patterns of change in relationship. Biology moved away from fixed essences towards understanding dynamic networks, regulation, feedback loops. Cognitive science, too, has shifted from static symbols towards predictive processing, seeing the brain as constantly generating and updating models. Hegel's core idea that stable things are really just slow-changing processes echoes motion theory's perspective almost perfectly. Things as sustained motion patterns.
So the thing is just the pattern that holds together for a while.
Right.
What else really stands the test of time?
Another really enduring insight is negativity as a driver. This idea that noise, error, friction, the not fit, these aren't just problems to be eliminated. They're actually the essential fuel. They drive exploration, evolution, learning, innovation. Hegel was quite radical in dignifying the negative, seeing it as inherently generative, not just destructive. Motion theory quantifies this. We talk about controlled desynchronization, brief periods of instability or error being necessary to knock systems out of suboptimal ruts and allow them to find new, more effective, more synchronized states. The source material has a great line for this. Hegel's negativity is just the universe's try a better phase.
Try a better phase. I like that. It makes error sound like an opportunity. And
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier his idea about repeating stages.
Yes, exactly. His notion of recursion across domains. Hegel spotted that his core logical stages, being essence, concept, seem to repeat themselves at different scales and in different areas, in nature, in individual minds, in the sweep of history. Motion theory has a similar idea it calls grammar portability. This means fundamental dynamic principles, things like coupling strength, leak rate, symmetry breaking. You see these same basic rules or patterns showing up everywhere, from how atoms interact to how cultures evolve.
A kind of fractal logic to reality. And what about systems maintaining themselves?
Right. Finally, his ideas around self-reference and closure have proven incredibly prescient. Think about concepts that emerged much later, like autopoiesis in biology, self-creating systems, homeostasis in physiology, maintaining internal stability, or control theory in engineering. These all validate Hegel's intuition that systems can, and often do, generate and maintain their own constraints, their own operating rules. His idea of the concept being self-legislating. Motion theory models these explicitly as dynamic loops that contain internal error terms, allowing them to constantly monitor their own state and adjust to maintain synchronization and achieve goals.
Okay, so he was clearly ahead of his time in many ways, but let's put on our critical hats for a second. Where did Hegel maybe push things too far or get a bit fuzzy, and how does motion theory offer a potentially clearer, more grounded perspective?
That's fair. One area is definitely the sense of teleology and necessity that sometimes creeps into his work, especially his philosophy of history. His narratives can occasionally sound like history had to unfold exactly the way it did, guided by some sort of inevitable logic towards a predetermined goal. Motion theory strongly resists this kind of necessity claim. It sees development as fundamentally path-dependent and probabilistic. Sure, underlying dynamics and attractor states, bias outcomes make certain paths more likely, but they don't decree them. There's always contingency, chance, branching possibilities, no guaranteed endpoint.
That feels more aligned with, say, evolutionary biology. Probability is not destiny, and then there's the famous difficulty of his writing.
Oh, absolutely. You can't talk about Hegel without acknowledging his obscurity as method. Let's be honest, his prose is notoriously dense, complex, and often seems almost deliberately difficult. Even experts struggle with it. Motion theory aims to keep the profound insights that focus on process, negativity, recursion, but crucially, it replaces the sometimes vague or metaphorical language with quantifiable variables. Instead of just talking abstractly about contradiction, we can measure phase errors, desynchronization events. Instead of synthesis, we look for measurable increases in sync density S, coupling C, reductions in leak R, changes in symmetry G. The dialectic becomes less of a mysterious philosophical force and more like observable transitions on a dynamic control landscape. It aims for precision where Hegel was sometimes, well, less precise.
Making the fuzzy measurable. Got it. And his ultimate philosophical stance, idealism.
And finally, yeah, his absolute idealism. At certain points, Hegel can sound like he's saying that matter is ultimately just a form of thought, or that mind is the fundamental reality and the physical world is somehow secondary, an expression of spirit. Motion theory takes a different stance. It's fundamentally motion first, not mind first. Cognition, consciousness, thought, these are seen as very special, complex types of motion loops, specifically loops that model other loops. But they arise from the underlying physical reality of motion. They aren't the primary substance of it.
Okay, that helps clarify the distinctions. So moving from the abstract, what does this all actually look like in the real world? It's easy for this stuff to feel very philosophical. Where can we see this dialectical motion playing out, not just as a concept, but as something observable, maybe even measurable?
Great question. It really is everywhere once you start looking. Take physics, for example. Think about symmetry breaking. In the very early universe, or in certain materials, you might have a state of high symmetry. But these states can become unstable under certain conditions, certain couplings. What happens? The contradiction between competing tendencies, competing order parameters, resolves itself. The system transitions into a new, lower symmetry phase, but one that often contains traces or combinations of the previous competing tendencies. In motion theory terms, that's a controlled rephasing that manages to increase synchronization density, S, but in a new, more complex configuration or basis.
Like the universe performing an Aufhebung on itself at the quantum scale? Cool. What about in living things?
In biology, think about morphogenesis, how an organism develops its shape, how tissues and organs form from initially simple cells. This often involves opposing chemical gradients, things called morphogens, spreading from different points, and mechanical forces creating tension. These competing signals and constraints act like the contradiction, the synthesis, the emergence of a complex structured pattern, a limb, a segmented body, the intricate folds of the brain with a whole new level of functional coherence. It's like a physical dialectic unfolding.
And you mentioned cognition earlier, even in how our brains work.
Yes, definitely. In neuroscience, especially with models like predictive coding, these models increasingly view perception itself as a kind of dialectical process. Your brain is constantly generating predictions about incoming sensory information. When the input doesn't match the prediction, that creates an error signal that's the negation. The brain then works to minimize this error. How? By updating its internal generative models. Crucially, it preserves the parts of the model that were working, that made accurate predictions, and selectively upgrades the failing parts. That process minimize error, preserve what works, upgrade the rest, that is Aufhebung, happening millisecond by millisecond in your head as you perceive the world.
That's incredible. It's running Hegel's logic constantly. And what about us interacting in groups?
Absolutely. In social systems, think about how institutions evolve. Often you have conflicting claims or interests, maybe labor versus capital, or the central government versus regional demands, or different social movements pushing for change. These conflicts, these contradictions, create tension and instability. They often force the creation of new rules, new compromises, new social contracts. The most durable reforms, the most successful syntheses, tend to be those that manage to preserve the functional parts of the old system, the stable subloops, while fundamentally rewiring incentives or structures to achieve a higher level of overall system stability and integration, reducing the leak caused by the conflict, increasing the system's S.
This is really where it gets exciting for you, the listener. We're moving beyond just understanding a philosopher. How can we actually take these ideas and test them with numbers, with experiments? Motion theory seems to offer a way to turn Hegel's insights into things we can actually measure, into falsifiable hypotheses.
Exactly. That's the goal, to make it empirically tractable. We can make some quite specific predictions. For instance, A, negation is learning gain. We'd predict that in tasks where an AI or even a person is learning adaptively, significant performance jumps won't just happen randomly. They should occur after specific kinds of error signals, what we might call structured error bursts, that clearly indicate a mismatch between the current model or strategy and reality. We could even predict that the specific features of these error bursts, their timing, their pattern will predict the magnitude and direction of the subsequent jump in performance or policy change.
So not just any error, but a particular kind of informative error triggers the breakthrough.
Precisely. Or take B, Aufhebung, as compression. Imagine training neural networks on tasks that change over time. Motion theory would predict that the successful synthesis phases, moments where the network adapts effectively to the change, should correlate with two things simultaneously. First, model compression, meaning the network finds a more efficient, simpler way to represent its knowledge, like a drop-in minimum description length. And second, a generalization lift, It gets better at applying its knowledge to new situations, all while demonstrably retaining key functional submodules from its previous state. We could test this against control conditions that just experience random noise instead of structured, informative errors.
In turning that lens onto human interaction, how could we measure recognition?
Well, for C, social recognition loops, think about groups involved in negotiation or cooperation over time. Motion theory predicts that stability and effective collaboration should emerge when the participants' ability to mutually predict each other's behavior crosses a certain accuracy threshold. You could experimentally manipulate things like how much information agents have about each other, information symmetry, and then measure the system's dynamics. You might see distinct phase transitions between patterns of dominance and submission, like Hegel's master bondsman, and patterns of stable cooperation, depending on that mutual predictability.
That's a really concrete way to study something as complex as social trust. What about broader cultural shifts?
You can even look for D, dialectical oscillations in language or culture. If you analyze huge data sets, large text corpora spanning centuries, maybe data on artistic styles, philosophical trends, you might look for evidence of recurring alternations between opposing poles. Think classicism versus romanticism, or periods emphasizing communal values versus individualistic ones. The hypothesis would be that these aren't random fluctuations. You could look for specific signatures, like regularities in the timing or nature of the reversals, maybe phase-locked cycles, that go beyond what simple chance or random drift models would predict.
Fascinating. And one more, maybe back to the fundamental level.
Sure. A physics analog. Competing orders. In certain advanced materials, particularly quantum materials, you can have situations where two different kinds of order want to establish themselves simultaneously, say, superconductivity and some form of charge density wave. They compete, they contradict each other. Motion theory would predict that carefully perturbing such a system, perhaps with specifically tuned noise designed to selectively desynchronize one order parameter, might actually trigger a transition into a novel phase. This new phase wouldn't be just one or the other, but perhaps a state where both orders coexist in a new, stable, coherent way, a kind of physical synthesis. These are all ways, essentially, to take Hegel's very deep, very philosophical intuitions and translate them into questions that we can actually investigate empirically, with data.
That is truly remarkable, taking this profound, sometimes intimidating philosophy and grounding it right here in measurable reality. Before we wrap things up, maybe just a quick human moment. To ground the philosophy itself, who actually was Hegel, the person driving all this, thinking about motion and change?
Yeah, good point. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He was born way back in 1770 in Stuttgart, Germany. He started out studying theology, actually, and was deeply immersed in the ancient Greek philosophers. Critically, he lived through and intensely watched the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era unfold, which profoundly shaped his thinking about history, change, and the power of ideas to reshape institutions. He had academic posts in several major German universities, Jena, Nuremberg, Heidelberg, and finally the prestigious University Berlin. His output was just immense. The Phenomenology of Spirit is probably his most famous work. It's this incredible journey tracing how consciousness matures by encountering contradictions and failures. Then there's the science of logic, which is this incredibly dense abstract blueprint for the logic of process itself. Sadly, he died relatively young in 1831 during a cholera epidemic in Berlin, but his influence was immediate and massive. His followers famously split into left Hegelians, like Marx, who focused on the dialectic as a tool for social critique and revolution, and right Hegelians, who were more conservative. His vocabulary, his way of thinking about systems, change, and feedback fundamentally shaped not just philosophy, but sociology, political theory. Really, he paved the way for systems thinking, where his dialectic got recoded into ideas like feedback loops and evolution.
Wow. Quite a life, quite an impact. So, from that incredibly rich, maybe sometimes turbulent intellectual ferment, all the way to the precise language of motion theory we've discussed today, this deep dive, I think, has shown us something really transformative. The core takeaway for me is clear. Hegel's dialectic, it's not some kind of mysticism, right? It's not just wordplay. It's actually a disciplined intuition about how real systems, physical, biological, social, mental systems actually advance. Internal mismatches, contradictions, they generate structured errors. Those specific errors then drive a rephasing and adaptation. And the new form, the synthesis, crucially preserves what was valuable while canceling out what failed. Aufhebung.
Exactly. And if motion theory could have a respectful chat with Hegel today, maybe with a whiteboard and some equations, it might say something like, look, you are absolutely spot on to make motion, process, the fundamental truth of being. Our contribution is trying to quantify that truth, measure it with rates, coupling, symmetry, synchronization densities, and it would add, Contradiction isn't a scandal or a flaw in logic. It's the motor of reality. In our lab, we see it as the error signal that unlocks pathways to better, more robust synchrony.
And for you listening to this, the practical payoff here is potentially huge. It's a different way to view challenges, isn't it? Don't just treat contradictions, tensions, errors as failures to be avoided or lamented. Think about treating them as fuel. Can you design your approaches, your interventions, maybe in your work and your learning, even in relationships, to create the right kind of constructive negation, the kind that prompts a genuine upgrade? And when things do change, when synthesis happens, measure it not just by novelty, but by compression. Did it get more efficient? Plus, expanded coherence, does it handle more complexity? Remember that great quote from our source? Truth is the whole, i.e., the network of synchronized motions that survives contact with error.
Which really leads to a final provocative thought for you to take away. If reality at its core is this ongoing process where contradictions drive the emergence of richer, more complex forms, where might you find those structured error bursts, those moments of friction, mismatch, or challenge in your own life or work right now? Could they actually be hidden opportunities for a significant compressive upgrade? Something to really mull over.
Think about those connections. Start seeing the world and maybe yourself in motion. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive.